Thomas and the New Guard. After the guard incident, Thomas grew a friendship with his guard. Every day the guard would walk to Thomas's shed in the evenings and talk with Thomas about his friends and family. But one day his guard fell ill and had to go take off work. Thomas was very miserable. "Don't worry, Thomas, don't worry, Thomas," said Annie and Clarabel to Thomas that night. "There's always another guard, you know. There's always another guard, you know." "I know, Annie and Clarabel," he moaned, "but he won't be the same as my own guard is." "I'm sure he'll be nice," replied Annie. The next day, Thomas came up to the station platform. The passengers got in quickly, the porters went up and down closing the doors, and Thomas waited for the substitute guard. He waited and waited, but still the guard didn't come. Just then, Bertie came up to Thomas.
Hello, Thomas,
he said.
What are you waiting for? Yes.
"Waiting for the substitute guard," replied Thomas. "He's not arrived."
Oh dear,
chuckled Bertie.
That's not good. Yes, you're going to be told off by the fetch controller then if you're late. Yes.
And with that, Bertie raced off, leaving behind a very annoyed Thomas. 10 minutes later, and still the guard hadn't come. The passengers were getting annoyed, and one even ran out of Annie to complain to the station master. Then footsteps were heard. It was the substitute guard. Thomas was relieved.
No,
grumbled the substitute guard, looking at Thomas.
I would be in my bed right now if I wasn't assigned to do this job.
Thomas was puzzled.
Well,
grumbled the guard. He blew his whistle and stepped into Clarabel, slamming the door. Clarabel was shocked. "How rude!" she shouted. Thomas then puffed away as fast as the line's speed would let him. He wanted to make up for lost time, but the guard kept shouting,
"Slow down, you!"
"But I'll be late! Shh, shh! But I'll be late! Shh, shh!" Thomas protested.
"No excuse,"
shouted the guard.
"I'm your guard, and you should do what I tell you to."
So Thomas, being someone who didn't want to argue, slowed down to about 25 miles per hour. This made the passengers grumble.
"We'll be late for work! We'll be late for work!"
they grumbled. When Thomas arrived at the station, it was about 10 o'clock, half an hour later than expected. Henry chuckled.
"You were complaining about me being late because of my system being out of order, little Thomas,"
he said.
"Well, look at you!"
Thomas was cross, but before he could say another word, the fat controller came along in his car and walked over to Thomas.
"Engines are supposed to keep the railway running and up to schedule, yes,"
he began,
"and not slow down a passenger train."
Thomas began to speak, but the fat controller said,
"I don't want to hear from you. Just don't be late again. Otherwise I'd have to send you to work at the yards. And you don't want that, do you? Yes."
He then walked away, leaving Thomas sad. That night, Thomas was in his shed when Edward came by. "Hello, Thomas," he said. "Mind if I spend the night here?" "Sure," replied Thomas. "No one uses these sheds apart from me." Edward steamed into the shed and said, "Thomas, I heard from Henry that you were late. Why was that?" Thomas replied crossly, "Because of some stupid substitute guard who tried to skip the job by sleeping. And when I tried to make up for lost time, he told me to slow down. And the fat controller blamed me for being late, even though I tried to explain what happened." Edward was shocked. "My, what kind of guard would do that? I'm pretty sure even substitute guards know how to be a guard, but the substitute we're talking about seems unqualified for the job. I feel sorry for you, Thomas." "Thank you, Ed," smiled Thomas, and he went to sleep. The next day, Thomas came to the platform and waited for the guard. Like yesterday, the guard was sleeping the job. At last, Thomas lost patience. "That's it! Shh, shh," he said. I don't want to be late like yesterday. He blew his whistle and steamed off. Thomas was steaming happily across the line. Come along, shh, shh, come along, shh, shh, he sang. We're coming along, we're coming along, we're coming along, we're coming along, sang Annie and Clarabel. Soon Thomas approached the level crossing. Suddenly, he saw a figure lying on the track. It was the substitute guard. Thomas applied his brakes. The crossing manager managed to close the gates, but Thomas smashed into the level crossing gates and derailed. Luckily, none of the passengers were too hurt, but Thomas was dazzled. The substitute guard stood up at last and looked at Thomas. It had been obvious that he was drunk.
Yeah,
He muttered.
here again.
Soon, Edward came in with the breakdown train. The Fetch controller was on board. He was very cross, but not with Thomas, but with the substitute guard.
Wilbert Terence,
He shouted, pointing at the guard.
what were you thinking, lying on the side of an open level crossing?
The guard looked surprised.
Sir, I can explain.
I know what happened.
Interrupted the Fetch controller.
Edward told me what Thomas had told him. You were trying to skip work by sleeping, making Thomas 10 minutes late from starting. Then, when Thomas was trying to make up for lost time, you tell him to slow down. He was doing 39 miles per hour. That is the speed limit on the branch line. And now you have caused an accident. You aren't qualified to be a guard. You are fired.
The guard said nothing and walked away. Thomas, said the Fat controller to Thomas. I'm sorry I didn't listen to you. I should not have jumped to conclusions. That's all right, sir, said Thomas happily. Thomas got a day off, and the branch line service was held off. When Thomas came back into service, his main guard had recovered, and Thomas was very happy to be back working with his old guard again.